very excited to be here, and after following Rob. So see what he did to me? You know, he had to twist my arm to come. No, I broke my hand skiing, in case you wanted to know. So it was quite a while ago, but I'm very excited to be here to talk to you because I think that there is a element going on in organizations today that is really going to make a significant amount of change. And I think you all are people that do consulting with companies like I have worked with and have done internal consulting with. And I want to share with you how you can use data, because I think data is going to be the next phase of where we are today from an organizational change and an OD point of view. And I think that the days of being able to tell the story from qualitative perspectives are over. And people who are going to be really successful in this field going forward are going to be people who have the ability to analyze what's going on in an organization, uncover the uncoverable, be able to tell that story, and help organizations focus levers within that organization to drive effective change. And I particularly think that the economic environment that we're in today makes it even more important, because we are not any longer going to be in companies where they're going to be paying massive and spending massive amounts of money on executive development, on coaching, etc. They are going to want to tell me quantitatively what has changed and how are you and how are we building the capacity of leaders within our organizations. So I don't know how many of you have heard of the term talent management 10 years ago? 2 people. How many heard of it 5 years ago? How many hear of it all over the place today? Right? Talent management is one of those things that has taken on a life of its own, and I am particularly amazed about that, to be honest with you, because I think that managing talent and developing leaders is a core competency of anybody who is in a organizational or human resource capacity within any company. But I am continually shocked at how many people don't do these kinds of things. But so let me walk you through an evolution of some of this, just to give you the history of it. I know that I only heard the term myself about 5 years ago, and this has been something that GE has been doing for 25 or 30 years and never used that phraseology. So the 80s and 90s, people talked a lot about succession planning. Are people ready to move into jobs? It's been my experience that most of those succession plans, just like strategic plans, sat on the shelf and were rarely used in organizations to fill jobs because people left and companies scrambled immediately to get a body into a seat to continue on. They really weren't very strategic. Promotions, who are we going to promote? Who's a good person? Who does really well? Usually the feedback and the analysis of what makes this person a really great person was weak. I don't know how many of you ramble around organizations, but if you do that for a while, you say, why'd you promote Pete? Good guy, always delivers. Well, that's very actionable feedback, right? Good guy, always delivers. I'm really clear what I need to do to get to my next job from that kind of feedback. What's our pipeline? What are the gaps? Paper-based, not really used. Today, it's a much more integrated kind of situation. People are talking about, CEOs are worried about what's the health, some CEOs, let me put it that way, are worried about what's the health of my organization, what's my capability, do I really have the leaders today that are going to take me to take my company, to help take my company to that next level, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years out. And this is a real issue, I think, for corporations today, the whole question of sustainability. And we are seeing it play out quite dramatically in front of our eyes. Now, General Electric Company has been around since the late 1800s, and it's been on the New York Stock Exchange since that time. My guess is it plans to stay there. And the reason it's planning to stay there is because it's one of the very few companies that has focused so much on its long-term capability and sustainability of its organizational models. Quality. What's the quality of my leadership? do I really have the leaders that can drive high performance? Now, most companies will not talk about constructive cultures, but they will talk about high performance. And if you look at how they define high performance, it's very closely aligned to a constructive leadership style, and the reason is because it comes right from the literature, and that's why it's there. Data, again, people in the C-suite listen to data. And I was intrigued by what Rob had to say, because there are some organizations that will continue to dig because they are vertical thinkers. And so they use the data to obfuscate and to not take action. And they continue to dig and continue to dig. There are other organizations, however, that understand that data can be really a way to directionally point you to what you need to do to drive change and drive effective improvement within your organization. It's kind of that positivist versus negativist view, where you're looking at where do I want to be and where does my company need to be down the road, and what's the data telling me against where I am today, so that I can use the data to drive a talent playbook. And I think that's missing in many, many organizations that I work with, and I interact with tons of top companies around the world, is that talent playbook and really understanding what are the gaps in my organization. Where is it that I'm lacking, not from a negative point of view, but from where I need to be 3 to 5 years out, and then what do I do to close those gaps? Track that from a baseline perspective and drive action against it. So today it really is a key area of focus, and I'm amazed as I go around to organizations how immature on a maturity scale this practice is in companies. And I really think that the tools from human synergistics can help people get much crisper and more focused. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how you can use them. Where I think it's going to be in the future, and I think it is going to be much more of a central component of any organization's organizational aspects, human resource aspects. And I think that it's going to be part of the business strategy. So anybody that cannot understand the business strategy and align their talent initiatives, their people initiatives, their organizational initiatives to that business strategy are going to be left in the dust, so to speak. So the important part here, which I don't see yet in organizations, but I think it's coming, it's unquestionably coming, is that there will be organization plans, there will be people plans as clear, as specific as there is a financial plan in any business today. Nobody would acquire a company without going through their books, right? Right? Nobody would. They understand the financials, they understand the EBITDA, they understand the market valuation, etc. But do they really understand the people? We'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon, and that's the critical aspect that most acquisitions have failed because of the lack of understanding around the people part and the cultural part. That there ensures cultural alignment. You know, when I started out in this field, I've been in OD a very long time, and I was always intrigued by it. And you would talk to people about culture, and it wasn't really understood. And I would propose to you, and you're all consultants working with organizations today, I would propose to you that it's still not really clearly understood. But that culture and the behaviors that leaders demonstrate and the linkage between those two are so critical in driving high performance, and the ability to show leaders the cultural elements and how that's getting in the way and or enhancing what they're trying to do as a company is going to be a cornerstone of business going forward. So I think anybody who understands those elements of culture and can explain it in a way that shows business impact is going to be that much farther ahead. So I think culture to me is at the ripe time. And then the final piece here, I think, for talent management as we go forward is having a clear and consistent operating rhythm. Any company that does this well has the data, understands the culture, understands the leadership best practices that are driving that culture, rewards that, and has a regular operating rhythm around reviewing that and making sure that that's linked to the business planning, to the financial planning, and the people planning process, and they're integrated within the organization. So how does one go about doing this? And I'm just sharing with you because many of you don't actually work. How many of you actually work inside a company? How many of you are actually employees of a company? So a few of you, good. And then some of you consult externally. And so I want to share with you what the critical elements of, in my experience, have been of any core talent management program. First of all, you have to have a diagnostic element, and how many of you use 9 blocks? And right, so that's the common one. 4-box. HP uses a 4-box model, but there's some methodology, either a talent plot or some way that you look at the performance of an individual, which is a predictor of how they have performed in the past, versus a capability element, and plotting talent in some form or fashion that tells you who's really doing the best in your organization and who's, probably not an exemplar of what you want, and the gradations in between. So there's some way that you have to look at that. And then there's a skills inventory against this. What are the kind of skills that we have today? You take a technology company. I mean, HP is the largest technology company in the world, and it's a hardware company. And everyone knows in technology that the real money is in the software end of things. So how do you look at your inventory of skills, and how do you begin to say, if I need to take this in the future, how do I begin to understand what are the skill sets that I need to develop going forward? And then a cultural assessment. And here, again, we'll talk a little bit more about how that can be leveraged. Global and diverse mix. And I'm always amazed. When I first started coming to Europe and in other parts of the world, people would say to me, diversity, that's a U.S. thing. That doesn't apply to us. But as you start looking across companies, and it's becoming much more of an issue, there are many people, in fact, I've been meeting with them this week that I've been here, for multinational global companies who are incorporated in the EU, who are spending a lot more time thinking about the diverse elements, because you can't avoid that in a big global multinational company, because you have differences of perspectives, you have differences of philosophies, you have different cultural elements that are going on both in the nationalities as well as within the corporations themselves. So it's an important thing to look at. So for me, when you think about talent management, a key part of this is being able to segment your population, being able to look at that population almost as a portfolio. Who are your best leaders? What do your middle leaders look like? What do your managers look like? What are they doing differently? How do you align your leadership development exercises to begin to close the gaps in those various different populations? Assessment for me is so important. And this is what really begins to tell you what is really going on in your organization. It gives you a clear profile of the people that you value and what is it specifically that you value about these people, and what for you is your best-in-class profile. You can do it in a whole number of ways. You can use survey instruments, you can use your own internal 360s, you can use external organization. I used an external organization at HP, and a lot of that has to do with the culture of the company. It's not a company that trusts the internal assessment capability. GE was. I'm not saying that's good or bad, it just is. So in that company, we used an external assessment process. But you need a couple of data points, more than just one. Everybody's got the company 360, which is an articulation of the behaviors. We at GE used the company 360, but we also used the leadership impact survey, and we used an additional psychometric survey. The value of that was the ability to have several data points so nobody could walk away from their feedback. And that was, it's very easy. Everybody gets 360 feedback. Well, you don't understand. I just had to lay off a whole bunch of people in my business unit. And gosh, I had to take salaries down, or I was in a merger and acquisition, and I really got killed. And, that's why my 360 is the way it is. And I've heard it all. You've heard it all, right? Everybody's heard all of this stuff. You add another data point, and all of a sudden you begin to see that you have a statistically valid survey that's been around since 1995, tested in bazillion organizations, and say, here's a few little common trends here. So this is going on in your 360, but look at what's going on here. That's interesting that it's kind of a correlation there. And then you throw in a third instrument. I, in many cases, use the Myers-Briggs. It's, sort of overused, but there are a lot of elements in there that do correlate across the board. If you're a lateral thinker, you're much more likely to be an NT or a visionary kind of individual, I would imagine. And if you're an SJ, you're much more likely to be a vertical thinker, a more traditional kind of approach. So when you look at these things, it really helps people understand themselves more. The trick is, though, that most people, when they do these kinds of instruments and assessments, only do it in training programs, only do it for their top talent, and don't do it for their entire organization. And when you do it for your entire organization, at HP we took all 700 vice presidents through a very rigorous assessment process. We took it all the way down to our directors. We had 5,000 directors. So this is a huge organization. Just think about it, 700 vice presidents worldwide, 5,000 directors. When you do it in that kind of a rigorous fashion, it tells a story that is really incredible. And then you can begin to align your talent management strategies very specifically and very targetedly against the critical things that need to change in order to improve the organization. Not the multiple things that we all try to tell people, well, you have to have this and you have to have that. It's the critical thing. Who are the people who really need coaching, and what specifically do they need coaching on? And you have a baseline measure against which to track improvement and performance. So I think you're going to see more and more of that. And the data is absolutely a fascinating part. I don't have the HP data with me, but it really told a very interesting story. And it told a story of the people that were being rewarded. And it's very easy for you to hold up a picture then, a mirror that says, this is what's being rewarded in the company. Is this what you want to reward? If it's not, then we need to do something about it. And maybe it is what you want to reward. But then you have to ask the question, is this a short term? And is this what's going to sustain you for the long term? And the answer may be yes, and that's fine. The final piece is then aligning your human resource strategies, understanding who's the best, making sure that people get on the right jobs, and executing against those business strategies so that you have the feedback that comes from the talent reviews and comes from the assessments is aligned to what is being said in the performance reviews, so that there's consistency. It's aligned to the career plans, so that people don't get mixed messages. And in so many organizations, people get mixed messages. They really don't know what is it that I'm supposed to do to really be that exemplar of a top talent in this company. Tell me specifically what that is and how do I get there. And we often, and I think managers are very remiss because we don't give them the tools to give people feedback. And by using assessment data, you can give people the tools to say, here's what you're really great at. And here are the things that if you want to move to this next level, these are the skills that you're missing, and or these are the things that you may need to develop. And I have not seen anybody who's spectacular at doing that. But I think it's really an important thing. And in today's age, where we don't have a lot of money to spend on development, feedback and on-the-job experience, career plans, and helping people through coaching, et cetera, move forward in organizations is highly cost-effective. But you got to make sure that you know the feedback and you've got it aligned to the rest of the systems. Tracking results, this is a biggie. And particularly in human capital areas, I don't see a lot of science. I don't see a lot of quantitative information being used. I see a lot of people trying and struggling to show ROI. That's the big buzzword. But unless you have the baseline data against which you can track, it's very, very difficult to show improvement. Now, what we did at GE at a period of time, we had a baseline data, and then we would focus in on 2 or 3 areas that we were trying to improve. And then we tracked that and followed up 6 months, 8 months, and a year later. And we actually were able to show, and this is published in a number of places, we were actually able to show that the skill that we were trying to work on and the change that we were trying to drive quantitatively improved over a period of time. And we were able to show the specific interventions that were driving that change. So it's very important. Communication plans, I can't emphasize enough. People don't communicate enough. They don't tell their story. It's very, very important. So when you look at a talent management perspective, I think for those of you that are out consulting or doing this within your own companies, these are the critical elements that you need to think about. I have 8 steps. I think we're going to be sending them out to you after this, that you can think through the 8 steps that you need to have that would make any effective talent management or human capital system work effectively to build competency within an organization. So again, underneath, I think this is going to be the bellwether for the future, which is really having the data to tell your story and measuring against it. So here's just an example of a number of companies who have gone through, this is the leadership impact. And what I think is a very interesting story here, which underscores the importance of data and statistically valid surveys being used. In these companies, these were people who were determined through the talent review process, whether it be called a talent review or a talent inventory or session C, as they said at GE. These were people that were through that talent review. And these were people that were determined as top talent in the company. And you can very clearly see, you're all experts in this instrument, you can see clearly what I'm seeing. That there were 49 people from that group who were really, really top. And that's great. That's, pretty good. We were pretty smart in figuring out 49 people. But we also weren't too smart in figuring out that there were 50 people in this sample size, and there were many other ways we could have cut it, and this is a small sample. So this 100 people here is probably out of about 600 people. So there were 50 people in that sample who to the rest of the organization were being touted as top talent and exemplars of the leadership that we were trying to drive in these companies, who clearly were not. So without that data, we never would have known that. So it told us a couple of things. One, the process is somewhat flawed because clearly the process is not discriminating enough to get to the right people. And we never would have known this. The second thing is telling us that there's a bunch of behavior going on there and a bunch of people who are working. You figure every one of those 50 people, because these are very senior people, in very big global companies, probably have 10 to 15 people reporting to them who are sitting there in a company saying, I hear you, CEO, saying, this is the kind of behavior I want, these are the kind of leaders that I want, but I'm not seeing this every day. I'm seeing quite the opposite. I'm seeing people who don't want me to come up with new ideas. I'm seeing people who want me to operate based on power. I'm seeing people who want me to, tell them what they want to hear. I'm seeing people who are really restricting what I'm trying to do to drive high performance within a company. And when you multiply that, that's a pretty bad story. There's a lot of people experiencing a lot of negativity. And so when you hear people say they're not walking the talk, this is what's going on, and they're not walking the talk. Only a certain portion of them. What's scary about this slide is this is the top of the house, and this is the top talent. So if we even analyzed it further, which we have not, there's probably an even larger story in here. So then we look at this, and this is the alignment question. This is the connecting the dots of all your human capital strategies. Who's your top talent? What kind of feedback do they get? How are they being rewarded, etc. At least one of the human capital strategies was working because this is the same population cut a slightly different way. And we looked at where were the rewards being distributed? Now, in fact, this whole population got more of the rewards in the company, frankly, because they were the top talent. But differentiating that population, we did see that those people that had the more constructive leadership styles got the higher piece of the pie than the ones that had the destructive leadership styles. So somehow, somebody was figuring this out. But you share this information with the CEO or C-suite people. This is something that's going to get them to stand up and say, wow, I had no idea. Because most people don't analyze the data to this degree. The other thing that we found was really interesting, Rob and I asked the question and we said, is there anything that has to do with age? Because these are, you all use the instrument and you know that people can say how old they are and how much money they make, and that's how we got this. This is not, that we did some comparison against the salary data of a company. But we asked the question, I wonder if there's sort of a difference. And what we found out was really fascinating. The longer a leader had been with a company, the more constructive they tended to be in their style. Now, we didn't dig into that, and I think, Janet has some interesting data that may enlighten some of this, but what it said is that people tend to understand the culture more and the expectations, and the training and the development is perhaps a lever that really is building the kind of leader over time that you want. And in today's meltdown, if you're not developing these kind of leaders for the long haul, you're creating a culture that can be very destructive, defensive, and aggressive in a very difficult time. And you're losing your capability to sustain your leadership talent over a longer haul. So I personally think this is not the time to not be focusing on development and not to be focusing on human capital initiatives. This is the time more than ever to be focusing on it, but focusing on it smartly. And that's why data is so important. This is not a time to operate under goodwill. It's right to have diversity and, gee, you got to develop your leaders. You're going to have people saying, so what, I can't afford it, and tell me why it's really important. And that's why the data, I think, is so significant. So here we go, the ideal state for that very same population, interestingly enough, and this is no surprise to you who use these instruments all the time, is that these people do, whether they were restrictive styles or they were prescriptive styles, did believe that their ideal state was at the top of the clock, as they say. And profile is similar there. Here was another interesting piece. It was very interesting for me because, I just gave a keynote Friday in the States about diversity, and it's been very interesting to me because we have constantly, this subject has been around forever and ever. Why don't we promote more women? Why aren't we doing this? And the story never changes, because I don't know a company around that has a significant number of non-traditional talent at the very senior levels, including women. Don't know one, including the former companies that I've come from. They work on it, they make strides, but it's never it's slow, it's glacial. This data right here is, for me, fascinating. Because again, this is a data set of top talent from Fortune 20 companies, and it had about 700 or 800 people in it, I believe, and 20% of the population were women who are, equal in terms of the jobs that they do with the rest of the data set. And we went in and we said, let's look at this and let's see what the difference is between the best of the men and the best of the women in this data set. And, I don't need to tell you, you can look at that. There's not a huge amount of difference. Not a huge amount of difference. So then why are we not, from a talent perspective, why are we not promoting more women to senior positions, at least as equally as we are men? That does beg the question. Now, when you dig a little deeper into the behaviors in this data set, another very interesting component comes out. And that is, is that the women tend to be a little bit more catching people doing things right and giving them positive feedback, more, as Rob would say this morning, more prescriptive, more perhaps lateral in how they think about things, more, I hate to use this word, so I'm not going to use it, more lateral and more prescriptive, more positive in helping people think about where they need to go and what they need to do to get better. Men, on the other hand, tend to be catching people doing things wrong. And the feedback that they tend to give is around what you did not do, your example, Rob, in the statistical case, what you did not do. And I asked Rob when we sat down, I said, when you've done this exercise around the world, I would be very interested to know, because the A form, the people that had the correct, got the answer. And it seemed to me, it would be very interesting to know how quickly, because I think there's a direct correlation between that. If you're constantly told what's wrong, it drives fear, because you're afraid you're going to be told what's wrong again. If you're told what's correct, and you say, oh, well, and it's much more reinforcing, much more reinforcing. I'd be interested in that and see how that went. But I think this is a very, very interesting chart. Again, it goes back to data and talent management and understanding how to segment your population, that it tells you that there really is no statistical difference here. And it kind of debunks a lot of, well, women don't do and women can't have, and it's really not true. I'll tell you something else. I've had a lot of leaders say to me, oh, well, women won't move and they won't do this and they can't. I find, because I interview in my previous roles, nobody got into a senior executive position unless they got through me somehow or another. And I had as many men telling me, I can't move, you know, I've got kids in high school, blah, 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 as I had women. Of course, I talked to more men because there were more men on the slates for the higher level positions. To me, it's not a function of women or men, it's a function of where you are in your life cycle. If you have teenage kids, they're in high school. People don't like to move, whether you're a man or a woman with teenage kids in high school. If you get them before they get to high school, or you get them before they have any kids, or after they're in college or something like that, it tends to be much, much easier. So ideal impact, again, not a significant difference here. This was the self-report, but here is another way that you can begin to take this data and parse it to tell a story about what you may need to do differently if you're trying to drive high performance in an organization, and also to show you where you may want to move the needle. Now, when we said Anglo, and we talked about this a lot, whether we would, how we would break this out, but the Anglo population is really the US, Australia, Canada, and England. Because we considered, if you know Hofstadter's work, that there's a lot of similarity around those particular country cultures, and that might have an influence. The European, I believe that includes Latin America. Is that true, though we wouldn't have said that necessarily? It didn't, okay. Yeah, because we wouldn't have called it European. But you can see that the rest of Europe has a slightly different profile here. There is less defensive behavior going on in the Anglo areas than there are in the rest of the European countries. And interestingly enough, as we would say, as we would expect, there's more approval and conventional behavior going on in the Asian ideal state. So this is what people believe is the way organizations should be running. So we thought that that was kind of an interesting difference, and again, it would anchor the areas that you need to focus on when you're trying to drive developmental initiatives within an organization, when you're trying to do coaching to drive towards high performance or constructive styles. Here's what the impact was, though, which is very interesting, even though everybody generally had a similar view of the ideal state with some differences relative to power and some differences relative to approval. The actual situation was that the Anglos, still the Asians were higher on the approval and the conventional behavior, but the actual picture um, is pretty similar across the board of what the reality tended to be. Again, this was a data set of top talent across the board. So you can begin to see, if this is your actual situation, then you have your ideal situation. And now, assuming that your leadership of your organization agrees to what the ideal is, you can track this over time. And you can begin to show how this picture is changing over time. And you can dissect this information, which I would highly recommend, one step further, which is, what are the specific leadership behaviors that are going on that are driving this picture? And you can do that. You can isolate that. And then those become the behaviors that you develop against, you give feedback against, you do coaching against, that you follow up against, because we all know doing 360s, you're not going to do a whole 360 again to show improvement, right? Because that's not a statistically valid measure, but you can show improvement around the 2 or 3 things that you're working on within an organization. And this will tell you that. This will tell you very specifically. And I'll tell you, in some of the companies where I've worked, we have focused our leadership initiatives then around those critical gaps, which often is something like coaching, it's something like communication, it's giving positive feedback, and those are the things that we worked with our leaders around. And then those were the things that we began to measure, and those were the things that we began to give really effective rewards about. So when I kind of lay this out and I think about it, some critical questions, and this is really for practitioners, I think, and people that are working with practitioners and helping them trying to be better in what they do. I look at, how do companies really fill jobs, and are they creating a culture for the long term? And again, if you do these kinds of analysis of the leadership behaviors and the culture and the cultural impact, you can begin to see, these are the kind of people I need to bring into this company if I want a more constructive, high-performance culture. So I need to hire to that. I need to have that profile. I need to have my leaders and my human resource professionals, my recruiters, out there understanding that these are the characteristics that we want in our leaders. And I need to begin to measure that. And I need to be able to say up front that these are the only kind of people that I'm going to put on the slates that have these kinds of skill sets and have these kinds of behaviors. Or I'm filling a job for the short term, and I'm reactive. And if I'm filling a job for the short term, shame on any organization that does that, because what happens is somebody walked out the door, they didn't know that they were going to walk out the door, which is a problem in and of itself, and then just put somebody in expediently into the job without considering, are these people going to be cultural fits? Are they exemplars of the culture that we are trying to model? And then what are the things that I'm going to do to support them over time to be sure that the old culture doesn't subsume them, and that they really can drive the change that we were hoping for. And that goes into your onboarding and all of those other kinds of things. On average, which I don't know if you know this, on average, a very senior executive position in a multinational Fortune 100 company costs about $300,000 in search fees. Staggering number. And you look at major corporations today and you say, they can be recruiting, if they don't have a good talent system, they can be recruiting on average in a year 50 to 70 executives. So you do the math. That's a lot of money. And if that executive fails because you brought somebody in who is an exemplar of the new culture that you're trying to get, right? And you don't put support systems in place, etc. That person fails. First of all, it reverberates in the organization. I knew they'd never make it. This too shall pass. We've all heard those kinds of words. But also, you've lost a huge talent and a huge opportunity and its extreme cost. So are you clear on the cultures required and the skills required of leaders? This goes back to, I'm repeating what I've already said, be very crystal clear on the skills that you're looking for and the culture that you're trying to drive. And believe it or not, there are places that are defensive aggressive and they like it. But as an employee coming in, you better know that, because you're only going to be there about 2 or 3 years if you survive that long. And as a company, there's going to be consequences of having that kind of an organization. Can you tell the diversity story through the data, like I was just doing, relative to women, relative to global talent, et cetera? Because you can really look at these databases and you can begin to say, you know, how are our global talent, however you define that, how do they look against the corporate headquarters? Because it's my experience that most of the top jobs go to wherever your company is incorporated. I'm from American companies. All the big jobs tend to be in the United States. If you're from a German company, my guess is most of your big jobs are in, you know, Germany, et cetera. So how are the differences there? And that can help you as you're trying to move talent around and you're trying to get the best people in the right jobs. And can you make the tough calls? And this goes back to the circumplex I showed you earlier. There were 49 people who very strongly were driving defensive, aggressive cultures within an organization. And can you sit down and have the tough calls and tough conversations with your leaders and say, you need to do something about this? And can you hold people accountable to that? And the second you look the other way, you've just sent a whole huge message to your organization. The second you look away, once you know this. So, and data is power, but when you have the data, you have to have the courage to take action. And do you have the workforce analytics at your fingertips? And it just resonated so much with me what Rob was saying. Analytics tells a story, but the analytics can't be the end-all and be-all to keep digging, keep digging. It's got to be the platform against which you take action towards future improvement and success. So those are my thoughts, and I guess we'll have time after this and after break to go into some Q&A. So thank you.